high above the North Sea. An aging propeller plane tumbles from the sky.
The first headline was Sabotage.
Investigators consider a string of possibilities. It takes 2 years to find the cause.
Unbelievable.
It's something that's never been seen in any previous investigation.
They looked at that and said, man, oh man, how could that be?
It would lead to arrests half a world away and call into question the safety of one of the world's most important planes, Air Force One.
It reached all the way to the aviation that flies around the President of the United States.
.30 p.m., September the 8th, 1989.
Oh, hang on.
Knut Tvetem and Finn Petter Berg are flying a charter flight from Oslo, Norway, to the German city of Hamburg.
Partner 394, radar service terminated.
The plane is about 100 kilometers from the Danish coast.
124.55 by partner 394. How was dinner?
Delicious. A little pricey, but delicious.
The two friends have flown around the world together, including remote areas of Africa. They're highly experienced, and both are only months away from retirement.
Copenhagen, good afternoon. Partner 394.
Flight level.
Partner 394, good afternoon. Radar contact, Copenhagen Control.
394.
The plane is flying 22,000 feet above the North Sea. The aircraft they're flying is a twin-prop Convair 340-580. It's a popular plane for short routes like this one. The plane has been chartered by the Norwegian shipping company Wilhelmsen. All 50 passengers are winners of a company lottery, sending them on a free trip to Hamburg to name a new ship.
Some had maybe been to naming ceremonies before, but the naming ceremonies are quite exciting. And the atmosphere was very, very, very good at the time of leaving.
One of the company's best employees is chosen to give a speech at the christening of the ship in Hamburg.
You have to deliver a speech, and it's not so very often that normal person within a company is giving the honor of naming a ship. But I just felt that that was right.
As the Convair crosses the North Sea, a Norwegian Air Force F-16 approaches the plane on its way home.
Whoa, look at that, 11 o'clock.
F-16.
Suddenly, the plane experiences a violent shock. The crew is caught by surprise. The plane begins rolling upside down. Air traffic control notices that Partner 394 is off course and falling from the sky.
Partner 394, Copenhagen Control, please report new flight level.
The crew is struggling to save the plane and the lives of everyone on board.
Terrain 14 flight level. Full up. Terrain. Full up.
Please report new flight level.
Then it disappears. It seems as though the charter flight has crashed into the sea.
Partner 394 en route to Hamburg is off radar.
Rescue teams race to the crash site, nearly 20 kilometers north of the Danish coast. They find only wreckage and bodies. All 55 people who were on the flight are dead.
I knew all the people. Some were close friends, some were less close, but I knew them all. And the pressure then felt double.
The shipping company is devastated by the news. Half the staff from its head office has been killed. It's the biggest airline disaster in Norwegian history. The nation is in shock. Jan Ovind is a young reporter for Norway's largest newspaper. He's assigned to cover this story.
One of the inspectors in the Norwegian FAA jumped to the conclusion that it had to be sabotage. And it was also stated by one of the Danish rescue team leaders, who said that they had no distress call. It just fell out of the sky, which meant it had to be a bomb or something. And somebody drew links to Lockerbie the year before.
In December 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. The evidence in that case is pointing conclusively to a bomb. Norwegian journalists uncover an intriguing fact about the partner plane.
Our Prime Minister at the time, Gro Harlem Brundtland, she used the plane on her campaign trip to the north of Norway. And I guess she used it for 2 or 3 days. And that was just 2 or 3 days before it crashed.
The nation wonders, could the tragedy have been a botched assassination attempt?
The first headline was Sabotage then on the whole front page.
A bomb would explain the plane's sudden plunge from the sky. Had the 55 people on board been the innocent victims of a murderer? Investigators looking into the mysterious downing of a passenger jet over the North Sea are facing a stunning possibility: that the plane was deliberately sabotaged. The Norwegian Accident Investigation Board recruits an Air Force investigator, Finn Heimdall, to join the team. It will be a severe test of his investigative skills.
It's good to be here. I started many years ago with the Air Force. And of course, I saw some investigations mishandled terribly, and I thought it can be done better than that.
Investigators hear from several witnesses who lend support to the idea that the plane was sabotaged. A young man claims to have heard a cannon-like sound coming from the crash site off the Danish coast. It may have been the explosion that brought down the partner plane. Searchers scour the surface of the sea for floating debris and for victims of the crash. Eventually, all but 5 bodies are found. They're taken to Denmark for autopsies. Those examinations reveal that some of the victims have small puncture-like wounds. This supports the notion that a bomb brought down Partner Flight 394. An autopsy on the first officer also uncovers something unusual. A complete, unbroken toothpick is discovered in his stomach.
Yeah, that was a odd finding, really, because it was pointed in both ends, and how can you swallow a toothpick like that? So he must have been exposed to a very shocking experience.
Please report new flight level.
But investigators can't confirm that a bomb brought down the plane. They'll need to know more about the final moments of Flight 394.
Partner 394 en route to Hamburg is off radar.
Nine separate radar stations tracked its final seconds. They could provide valuable clues. The most intriguing readings come from a military radar station in Sweden. Operators there tracked the Partner flight as it crossed the North Sea.
It started 1436.
The military radar has detected something unexpected. There is another object in the same airspace as the plane. It is not another airplane. It appears as Flight 394 started to plummet from 22,000 feet.
Idea what it is?
Simply didn't know what it was from the beginning. We had no idea what it could have been. It took more than half an hour, something like 38 minutes, and the question was, what is light enough to fall that slowly and solid enough to give radar returns like that?
Whatever the mysterious object was, it now lies at the bottom of the sea. A month after the crash, investigators are busy recovering sunken wreckage. They've plotted the position of the wreckage on the ocean floor using side-scan sonar. It sends out sound waves that are reflected back when they encounter objects. The sonar equipment has painted a remarkably accurate picture of the underwater wreckage. It helps investigators see that the plane parts have settled over a 2-kilometer wide area. It's an important piece of evidence.
It was evident that the aircraft had come apart in the air. It hadn't hit the sea in one piece, that was for sure.
The mid-air breakup suggests a bomb brought down the plane. But it will take weeks to prove this. In the meantime, investigators hope the plane's black boxes will provide more immediate insight into the crash. The plane's voice recorder and eventually its data recorder are recovered from the seabed and sent to labs for analysis. Both boxes were damaged in the crash. Investigators hope the damage to the boxes didn't affect the data.
Well, let's see what we got.
The voice recorder may have picked up a conversation between the pilots that can explain what happened on board.
Avionic CVR.
On? That's required.
Auto feather system.
Armed to 2 green.
The device usually records the final minutes of a flight, but this CVR has done the opposite.
Beta lights off.
Power.
It recorded the start of the flight, but then mysteriously stopped recording just before the plane took off.
Well, it had recorded the conversation on the ground, but as soon as the engines were upshifted to normal RPM for takeoff, it ceased operations. So that was a disappointment to us.
But the malfunctioning CVR did pick up an intriguing exchange between the two pilots.
How's the weather in Hamburg?
Oh, it's clear skies, good visibility.
Hope it stays that way.
The CVR does tell investigators that Flight 394 began with an unusual problem.
Partner was in financial dire straits, and we found out that just a few hours before the plane took off, the Norwegian aviation authorities sent out a telex to tell all the airports in Norway to don't let a partner plane take off because they owe a lot of money in non-paid charges and fees.
They won't release us for takeoff until we pay the catering bill.
How much you got on ya?
Seriously?
Huh?
Probably enough, actually. I'll take care of it then.
The first officer was forced to leave the cockpit to pay the caterers for onboard meals. Investigators check maintenance records to find out why the CVR only recorded the crew's conversation while they were on the ground. They discover that the plane's cockpit voice recorder had been modified more than 10 years earlier.
Modified to switch to primary AC.
It was altered so that when the engines were given full power for takeoff,
Your power.
the CVR would automatically switch from the plane's batteries to its generator.
And that modification was not working on this aircraft.
Neither pilot realized that as the engines were revved up for takeoff, power to the CVR was actually cut off.
Anytime you get key investigation components such as the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder that don't work correctly, it brings into question the thoroughness of the maintenance and also the continued operation, safe operation of the airplanes.
The malfunctioning voice recorder and the unpaid catering bill lead investigators to look more closely at the history of the airplane and the company that owned it, Partner Airlines. Partner operated a fleet of mostly older planes that flew to northern European destinations. The Convair that crashed into the North Sea was one of the airline's most recent acquisitions. But the plane itself was 36 years old. It had a complicated history of both ownership and modification. The biggest change was to the plane's engines.
The really important modification was upgrading the engines to turbine engines.
On prop planes, the propeller moves air backwards, propelling the plane forward. Early prop planes used piston engines to turn the propeller. But turbine engines, which use a series of fans, not pistons, to compress air, generate substantially more power. Heimdall learns that in 1960, the plane's original piston engines were removed and powerful new turboprops were bolted to the wings. It's a modification that provides more power, but could pose a risk.
When there was a tremendous increase of horsepower installing the turbine engines, I was wondering what that was doing to the structure of the aircraft.
Heimdall has been placed in charge of analyzing the plane's engines. He wants to know if the turbine engines could have torn the aging plane apart.
I started asking the question, how can an aircraft fly itself to pieces in midair?
The plane's flight data recorder should tell investigators about the operation of the engines in the moment before the crash. The recorder from this flight is a primitive analog model.
Used a metal foil strip that rotated, and some marking pins actually scratched on the metal surface, on the piece of metal.
The antiquated data recorder proves to be another frustration for investigators. It didn't record many of the parameters it was supposed to. But more mysteriously, the needle seems to have recorded certain signals twice. The double line confounds experts who analyze the device.
We had no experience with anything like that. We contacted several experts, but none had experience with this before.
Yeah, I've never seen that before.
The flight data doesn't offer investigators any immediate revelations about the crash. Heimdall now wonders if the very fact that the recorder was malfunctioning could be a clue in itself. He decides to send the flight data recorder back to the American company that made it for further analysis. Investigators painstakingly reconstruct the Partner plane.
The Norwegian team recovered the airplane with assistance from the local authorities, the Danish authorities, I believe, and decided to reconstruct the airplane. A reconstruction is like putting together a puzzle that helps investigators focus the investigation on areas that need to be looked at and perhaps prioritize the investigation.
As the fuselage takes shape, the reconstructed plane provides investigators with some stunning evidence.
The only thing that would destroy the aircraft at cruising level would be an explosion. So, and some of the parts looked maybe a bit suspicious.
Suspicious for what's on them.
There were rumors that it was found explosives in the partner plane.
There are traces of a powerful military explosive. The amount is small, but the press gets wind of it. The explosive residue could be from a bomb on board the plane, or from another source. A NATO war exercise called Operation Sharp Spear was taking place that same day near the flight path of Flight 394.
One of the pilots I talked to, and he said, I guess it might have been the so-called cold rocket, test rocket, might have gone through one of the wings or the fuselage.
Many people now wonder if an errant warhead played a role in bringing down the plane.
Pull up, terrain. Pull up, terrain. Pull up.
But when the explosive residue is analyzed, it's found not to have been from a bomb or a warhead. There simply isn't enough of it on the plane.
There was a small sign of explosives, but that was a very low level and looked more like a contamination than anything else.
Many battles have been fought off the Danish coast. The sea is littered with old munitions. Investigators believe the plane picked up some explosive residue while lying on the ocean floor. Explosives are ruled out as a cause of this crash. Metallurgist Terry Heaslip has been brought in. He examines the plane's reconstructed tail and makes a startling observation. Pieces of the plane's skin show evidence of damage from overheating.
Which means that it was flexing. And you take a coat hanger and you go like that, back and forth. If you hold it close to where it's going to break, you'll burn your hand because you develop heat where you're doing the fatiguing. It's the same thing on an airplane.
The evidence is pointing to a problem with the plane's tail. Investigators are keen to look at a massive generator recovered from the rear of the aircraft. The auxiliary power unit is housed inside the Convair's rear fin. It's a backup power generator that's usually only used while the plane is on the ground. Heimdall inspects the device and discovers that some melted plastic parts from the plane's cabin have found their way inside the APU's turbine. It gives him an important new piece of information about what was happening on the plane at the moment it failed.
Meaning that the cabin had failed when the APU was still operating.
The APU should not have been running while the plane was in the air. The fact that it was means the APU could be behind this crash. Investigators try to learn more about what happened on the day of the crash. They interview the mechanic who inspected the plane that morning. He reports that one of the plane's two main generators wasn't working, and that he wasn't able to repair it. Regulations demand that the plane have two sources of power before it's allowed to take off. The first officer comes up with a solution that will allow the flight to leave. He tells the airline that he will use the auxiliary power unit throughout the flight as a substitute for the malfunctioning main generator.
Okay, I want you to write this in the logbook. Released for flight with APU generator operative. We'll use the APU to power the left side AC system. APU is coming on. Beta lights off.
Your power.
During his inspection of the APU, Heimdall makes an important discovery.
When I saw the part, I saw that it was not an aircraft standard part at all. It was made in a very primitive way by a piece of iron and welding it together in a substandard way.
He notices that one of the mounts attaching the APU to the plane is broken. The unit contains a rapidly spinning turbine that generates electricity. If it wasn't properly held in place, it could have caused this crash. Investigators need to know if the broken APU caused the crash. They'll soon discover that it's just a piece of a much more troubling puzzle. Investigators have discovered that Partner Flight 394 was flying with a broken APU mount. Metallurgist Terry Heaslip performs extensive testing on the failed part.
My initial reaction was that the welding was bad, was probably inappropriate.
Heaslip wants to know when the strut broke. If it happened during the plane's last flight, it could explain the accident.
I could see the impact markings and the progression markings on it that showed that it did not fail in a single overload during this last accident flight.
The way the broken mount is worn down also tells Heaslip that the mount holding the APU in place didn't break on the day of the accident. It was broken long before Flight 394 took off. Investigators now need to know what effect the broken mount had on the flight.
40,000 RPMs. Do a lot of damage.
Yeah, but those damage.
The APU is a large gyroscope having a tremendous amount of energy in it when it's rotating. And if that energy is transmitted to the surroundings, the fuselage, the structure, it could impact the whole vibration pattern in the tail.
Investigators want to know if anyone had felt vibrations on this particular plane. Interviews with people who flew on it provide some answers.
Listen, we appreciate your coming in. Thanks a lot. Now, you said you felt some rumbling on the plane, is that right?
One person stated that the plane that crashed vibrated far more than the two other Convairs owned by the company.
Did anything seem unusual on the plane?
But others failed to mention the vibrations.
Had a good flight.
It's a puzzling situation. Investigators know the APU mount was broken before the flight, but they still don't know if it even played a role in the crash, or whether it would have affected the plane's tail. Then the reconstruction begins to clear things up. Heimdall discovers that two doors from the plane's tail have not been found.
When we reassembled the parts from the tail, we saw that the rudder had been torn apart in two major pieces and some parts were missing. In particular, the doors between the fin and the rudder were missing.
The Shroud doors are two small doors located on the vertical fin of the plane. They provide mechanics with access to weights inside the fin that control the rudder's movement. Heimdall makes a dramatic find about the doors themselves. They were constructed with an aluminium honeycomb liner. From his days in the Air Force, Heimdall knows they have a unique property.
This is thin aluminum foil, as you know, and it has the good reflective properties for radar, and it's very light. The military use it to disturb radar signals, call it chaff.
Investigators now realize that the unidentified object picked up by Swedish radar was probably a piece of one of the shroud doors.
But when we connected the missing doors and honeycomb with the radar data, we knew that it had happened up at cruising altitude, because the slow-falling object had come from very high level, cruising altitude practically.
Investigators conclude that the tail began to break apart at 22,000 feet before it plummeted from the sky. But why had the doors fallen off in mid-flight? Whatever caused the shroud doors to tear off likely caused the crash. Investigators know that the rudder's counterweights are located just inside the shroud doors. If a rudder moves too violently from side to side, the weights do as well.
We found enough pieces to show that it was just pounding these doors. And the first real components that came off were the honeycomb in those doors.
Investigators conclude that around the time of the accident, something caused the rudder to swing violently back and forth, but they still don't know what.
The APU with the broken front shock mount on its own, running in flight, would not cause the aircraft to come apart and the tail to come apart. There had to be extra factors there for that to occur.
Investigators continue searching for those extra factors. Then Partner Airlines proposes one. They point to the F-16 that passed over the plane just minutes before the plane veered off course.
Whoa, look at that, 11 o'clock.
F-16.
Partner claims the military jet was flying faster than it should have been. They also believe that it came much closer to the flight than officially reported.
Partner, they contacted the Swedish investigator, and he came out with the answer that the F-16 could probably have gone through the sound barrier as it passed just over the partner plane. When a fighter jet or any other plane breaks the sound barrier, you have this pressure wave, and their theory was that this pressure wave just got the plane to disintegrate in the air.
But the Norwegian F-16 pilot testifies that he was more than 1,000 feet above the Convair when he passed it. Investigators calculate just how close the F-16 would have had to be in order to seriously disturb Flight 394. They determined that for the F-16's pressure wave to have affected the Convair, it would have had to fly within a few meters of the plane. There's no evidence the two planes were ever that close.
Okay, good work.
90% of the plane's wreckage has been recovered from the sea. But investigators still don't know what caused the Convair's tail to come off in mid-air. During the course of the investigation, Finn Heimdall is given a promotion. But he has no idea how to solve the puzzle that haunts his nation.
They asked me to be in charge of the rest of the hardware investigation. I was standing in a heap of wrecked parts and thinking I'll never get to an end of this.
Investigators get a break when the faulty flight data recorder is analyzed in the United States. The manufacturer has asked its top expert to come out of retirement and examine the device.
Manufacturer Fairchild referred us to a previous employee, and we found him in California.
The expert tells investigators that the needle that was supposed to be recording the plane's altitude was shaking so much that it was leaving another mark on the foil. But then he goes one step further. The FDR has a capacity to record for hundreds of hours. By unspooling the metal foil completely, he sees that the FDR has been vibrating severely for months.
We saw that this had happened something like 360 operations hours before the accident.
I had never seen an abnormality like that before, and it took us a while to figure out what was going on here.
It now seems the APU wasn't the only thing vibrating on this plane. Investigators decide to chart the history of the vibrations chronologically. They notice an unusual change in the pattern of vibrations. 2 months before the crash, the vibrations suddenly stopped for a number of weeks.
Virtually no vibrations for at least 16 flights.
It was increasing intensity and frequency up to the summer of '89. And then the pattern changed.
After getting better, the pattern of vibrations got worse again, right up until the crash.
What happened here?
Investigators now need to find out what changed on the plane during the 2-week period when the vibrations stopped.
Why was it out of service? Where was the work done?
The airline tells investigators that during that time, the plane was receiving a major overhaul in Western Canada.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
The work was done by the plane's previous owner, a Canadian company that specializes in servicing Convaires. During the various test flights there, the FDR recorded almost no excessive vibrations. This healthy pattern continued on several passenger flights once the overhaul was done and the plane returned to Norway. Investigators review the maintenance records. Heimdall finds that during the overhaul, mechanics found signs of wear on one of the 4 bolts that connect the vertical fin to the plane's tail. These 4 bolts are the only things holding the tail to the fuselage. During the overhaul of the Convair in July of 1989, a mechanic replaced one of the 4 bolts. The information from the flight data recorder reveals that the vibrations in the tail stopped right after that 1 bolt was replaced.
You see that? And as they go across.
Incredibly, investigators are able to recover all 4 of the bolts which were holding the tail in place. Terry Heaslip thoroughly analyzes the bolts. He makes a final stunning discovery. The 3 bolts that weren't replaced were not approved parts.
We did metallurgical testing and we did mechanical testing. And by doing all of these analyses, we worked out that the 3 of the assemblies were not up to scratch. They were bogus assemblies.
His analysis shows that the faulty bolts were incorrectly heat-treated when they were made. As a result, they are only 60% as strong as they should have been. Investigators finally know why the tail was vibrating for months.
Got something for me?
3 of the bolts holding it in place were too weak.
They just weren't hard enough. Unbelievable.
3 bolts holding the tail to the rest of the plane were not authentic parts. They were well-disguised fakes. The weak bolts mean investigators now must answer a critical question.
Why didn't the tail come off in the previous 16 flights where it vibrated excessively? Why this last flight?
Investigators already know that on the day of the accident flight, a power generator wasn't working, and that the pilots improvised a solution.
Okay, I want you to write this in the logbook. Released for flight with APU generator operative. We'll use the APU to power the left side AC system. APU is coming on.
The pilots didn't realize that the APU mount was broken, and the motor was vibrating considerably. Their decision to run it throughout the flight made a bad situation worse.
The reason why things got bad on this particular flight is that the APU was literally floating on 2 mounts instead of 3.
This, along with the faulty bolts, created even more vibrations in the tail of the plane.
And when you get the two of them shaking, if they ever get into sync, what we call resonance with each other, disaster.
The investigators conclude that the vibrations in the tail and the vibrations from the APU could have combined into a lethal force.
Now, this is what we got from the guys at MIT. But technically, the vibrations could have torn the plane apart.
If the two loose items start to vibrate in the same frequency, now you're going to get, or a multiple of that frequency, you get what's called coupled harmonics. And the one vibration is feeding the other one. They're feeding each other and making each other worse and worse.
The most famous example of coupled harmonics occurred on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington State in 1940. The newly built steel and concrete bridge began swaying lengthwise, and then a crosswind started dipping it left to right. The two vibrations moving in different directions combined to create a violent twisting motion that tore the bridge apart. Investigators calculate that the same effect tore apart Flight 394.
And we said, my gosh, that's exactly the phenomena we have here.
This lethal combination of vibrations caused the tail to sway back and forth so violently that the rudder jammed to the left. This forced the plane into a left turn so abrupt that it increased airflow over the right wing, creating greater lift and causing the aircraft to roll. The plane recovered briefly, but the rudder jams to the left again, and the shroud doors explode. It rolls a second time, but the tail begins to disintegrate. After that, the crew didn't have a hope. Investigators conclude that it was the 3 bogus bolts that initiated the partner crash.
And I looked at that and said, man, oh man, how could that be in a crucial component, a crucial fitting like that in the tail? I couldn't believe it.
The report on Partner Flight 394 sends shockwaves throughout the aviation industry. It's the first time that a fatal plane crash has been linked to unapproved spare parts. It raises a frightening question. How many of the parts being put into planes around the world are bogus?
The Partner crash, that was the seminal event that started people actually having to recognize the unapproved parts problem and the fact that the worldwide inventories of aircraft parts, in fact, were contaminated.
There are 6 million moving parts on a 747 alone. The spare parts business is a $45 billion industry. And at the time of the crash, that industry was largely unregulated. Mary Schiavo is the former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, the agency that oversees the FAA.
No one knew how large the problem was. They knew it was a problem because of a crash, but how big was the problem in the United States? So we set out to measure it. We started by auditing the FAA's own parts bins. And the FAA's own parts bins contained 39% bogus parts. What we found is if the parts had come from a parts broker, which was a huge percentage of the parts supply industry, 95% of them were not authentic.
The FAA would soon find bogus parts on an airplane widely considered to be the most secure plane on Earth. There are 5,000 parts brokers in the United States, many of them in the Miami area.
Parts brokers had no regulation whatsoever. You had a telephone and a fax. You were a parts broker. Overnight, you could be in the parts brokerage business, and you could get them anywhere you chose. You could get them from junkyards, you could get them from scrap facilities, you could get them from old planes, you could get them from crashes, you could get them from people who are willing to manufacture and don't care about the law.
Spare parts for airplanes are expensive, A single bolt, like the one holding on the Partner flight's vertical fin, can cost up to $250. A bogus one can cost as little as $30.
Which makes it a bargain. And when you have situations like you have today, and airlines are bottom line driven, and you've got 8 or 10 major airlines in the United States, for example, that are on the verge of bankruptcy, they're looking to cut costs.
The FAA launches a major investigation into illegal parts and uses sting operations to uncover unscrupulous dealers. Investigators uncover a black market industry that makes thousands of worn and inferior parts look brand new.
These are really good counterfeits. It's very difficult to tell.
At the time of the Partner accident, there were checks and balances in the system that were supposed to keep bogus parts from getting on major airlines. For instance, each spare part needs someone's signature to verify its authenticity.
It has to have some documentation that states that it's airworthy. It has to have a maintenance release by some certificated entity.
But investigators discover that in addition to a huge market in spare parts, there's also a burgeoning market for counterfeit FAA tags.
We'd execute search warrants and find that people had printed stacks of fake yellow tags, and in many cases they'd sign with the name of an actual inspector, but they just forged the signature.
The tag in this business is worth more than the part.
At first, investigators believe the problem is mostly with smaller airlines.
Smaller operators and repair stations are usually the people who are most vulnerable to this aftermarket broker parts problem.
They're shocked when they discover that bogus parts have been found on what is supposed to be the most tightly controlled plane in the world, Air Force One.
It reached all the way to what many people consider literally the highest levels of aviation, the aviation that flies around the President of the United States. Supposedly in an airtight supply chain, we had bogus parts cases that touched those aircraft.
The FAA responds quickly. More than 100 dealers are arrested.
With every conviction, we were able to raise the level of awareness, not only of the problem, but of the severe consequences if you want to risk somebody's life. And I actually think that the most important thing that we did was get criminal convictions.
As a result of their investigation, the FAA institutes a much more rigorous system for documenting airplane parts. They threaten airlines with criminal charges if they knowingly accept bogus parts.
Things are different today because we have a whole body of regulations, much more than we had in the 80s and 90s even, to address the problem.
You have to get the mechanic who's actually got the wrench in his hand to a point of sophistication where he's knowledgeable enough to smell a bad part, to smell a bad piece of paper. And it is possible to do.
The new regulations achieved their goal. In the 2 decades following the crash of Partner 394, there wasn't a single fatal accident attributed to bogus parts. Years after the Partner crash, Finn Heimdall became the head of the Norwegian Accident Investigation Board.
My friend.
It was a major puzzle that an aircraft, for no obvious reason, could more or less disintegrate in midair.
His report into the accident resulted in major changes that likely saved lives.
That's a positive thing, but the negative, of course, is the tragedy, the personal tragedy to many people.
One of the smallest parts on a Norwegian charter plane failed in 1989. Because investigators found the cause of that accident, passengers around the world are safer. less likely to be on a plane that's fitted with bogus parts. At the chaotic end of a bitter war, the world's largest airplane is loaded with orphans and headed for safety.
Advancing throttles now.
Time. Go. We needed to get out of missile range.
But only minutes into their escape,
there was this loud explosion, one quick bang.
What was that?
the plane is out of control.
I kept going faster and faster and faster.
And headed for the ground.
Prepare for emergency landing! Mom, get down!
And then it was quiet.
South Vietnam, April 1975. After more than 10 years of fighting, the United States is on the verge of defeat. The end of the war is fast approaching. The enemy is closing in on the capital. On April the 4th, at a military base in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, a strange cargo is being loaded onto an enormous C-5A Galaxy. This is one of the largest planes in the world. The C-5A is primarily a cargo plane. Its hold is wide enough to carry tanks and tall enough to move buses. Above the cargo area, there's a small number of seats. Both the passenger area and the cargo bay are being pressed into service today. Dozens of Vietnamese orphans are being loaded onto the plane to be flown to safety. There are thousands of orphans to be flown out before the North Vietnamese take Saigon. Barb Adams works for the American Embassy. She and her daughter Linda are also fleeing.
On April 4th, my mom came home and told me that I had 1 hour to pack one suitcase and that we were going to be escorting the orphans on an orphan airlift back to the United States. When my mother and I went upstairs to the troop compartment, there's traditional airline seats, and all of the seats were filled with babies.
Sergeant Ray Snediger is in charge of loading the plane's massive cargo bay.
Make sure it's secure. We got people down there.
It was hard to control the situation. So many people were there, so much news media, so many people from the orphanages, so many military people, that it was actually pure chaos.
Just the day before, American President Gerald Ford announced the start of this desperate mission of mercy, a remarkable effort called Operation Baby Lift.
I have directed that C-5A aircraft and other aircraft especially equipped to care for these orphans during the flight be sent to Saigon. I expect these flights to begin within the next 36 to 48 hours.
Arnold Isaacs was covering the end of the war for the Baltimore Sun.
We had transport aircraft flying into Saigon every day, unloading military supplies and going back empty. And so it was decided that they could carry out the orphans on those returning flights. There were a lot of cameras and reporters out there covering the loading and the departure of the plane.
Captain Bud Traynor is in charge of Operation Babylift's first flight.
I got a call from the command post back in the States, and they said to me, how many people could you take out of Saigon if you were asked?
Because of the last-minute nature of the flight, they're running behind schedule. The plane is already 5 hours late, and Captain Traynor wants to be in the air. He orders the cargo bay doors to be closed.
Tell me what.
Doors closed. Loadmaster closed cargo bay doors.
The youngest of the 145 children have been crammed into the upper passenger section of the jet.
My mother and I were both assigned 3 rows of seats with maybe 4 to a row. So it would be 12 to 15 babies that we would be taking care of on the flight, feeding them, changing them, whatever they needed to have done.
Ina? Have a good flight, Ina.
There are 102 older children in the cargo area below. A number of adults from the American Embassy are also down here, keeping an eye on the orphans. Getting out of Vietnam starts by leaving the safety of the US base.
Advancing throttles now.
15. 20. Time, go.
Gear up.
I remembered that we had to take off at a pretty steep angle. And we didn't have seats, so we were to kneel on the floor between the seats during takeoff.
The cargo plane is heading for Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. It's a 2.5-hour flight. From there, the orphans will be sent to adoption agencies in North America and Australia.
We needed to take off from Saigon and make a very rapid ascent to get out of missile range.
Cargo planes are easy targets. They're slow-moving and large. The possibility of an attack is very real. Just 5 days before, North Vietnamese troops captured the South's second largest city, Da Nang. South Vietnamese forces are retreating towards Saigon. In the capital, the situation is chaotic. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians are desperate to leave.
Every day, another province was lost, especially after Da Nang fell. The population of Saigon, I think, began to fall into a sort of a paralyzed, petrified terror. Never, not for one moment that I remember, did you have a feeling of anyone rallying to defend the country.
How's the air in the troop compartment?
It's all right.
The baby's still squalling, or...?
They quieted down with all the noise.
Most are asleep.
Just as well.
Then, shortly after takeoff, as the plane climbs through 23,000 feet,
when the rapid decompression occurred, the plane filled with this mist. And so until it dissipates, you cannot see.
And there was this loud explosion, one quick bang.
What was that?
And she said, I'm not sure. And you could feel the plane heading downward.
Debris started flying around.
it's a classic decompression. Somewhere there's a massive hole in the plane's fuselage. The air inside the jet is rushing out. At 23,000 feet, there's barely enough oxygen to breathe.
So I looked over at the co-pilot, and he was putting on his oxygen mask, and I thought, I'd better do that too.
The oxygen masks have dropped automatically, but on such an overcrowded flight, there aren't enough to go round. The ones that are available weren't designed to reach babies.
As I looked out the window, I saw the ocean, and I said to my mom, I said, we're crashing, aren't we?
At the back of the passenger compartment, Lieutenant Marsha Wirtz checks in with the crew. From there, she can usually see down to the cargo bay below her.
Pilot, this is Wirtz. I'm at the top grade of the troop compartment. I can see the China Sea out the rear of the plane.
What?
The cargo door is gone.
With more than 300 people on board, Captain Bud Trainor's jet has lost its breathable air. Somehow, his massive aircraft has been badly damaged. And he's a long way from a safe place to land. The inaugural flight of Operation Baby Lift will not make it out of Vietnam. The next few minutes will determine if anyone even survives. Oxygen levels are dangerously low. Unlike the passenger compartment above, there are only a few portable masks for passengers in the cargo bay.
My first priority after a rapid decompression is to get the aircraft back down to a breathing altitude for all the passengers, which is 10,000 feet.
Taking it back to the airport.
And so I turned 180 degrees, and now I'm heading back for Saigon.
But before he gets back to Saigon,
Sergeant Snedeker.
Trainer needs to know how bad the situation is.
The airplane is going down in a left bank. At that particular point, I sense that we're going down. I go to the cockpit.
Sir! See what's going on.
And Captain Trainer tells me to go to the cargo compartment to see what's happening down there.
When I was in my descent, I went to my maximum speed, which is what you're supposed to do, to get to 10,000 feet. I got to my maximum speed, and I pulled back on the yoke, and nothing happened. I kept going faster and faster and faster.
Trainer's plane is diving to the ground, and he can't get it to pull up. At the back of the plane, Ray Snedeker descends into the center of the storm.
When I came down, I noticed there was a lot of chaos in the cargo compartment. Obviously, people were frightened. So I'm actually crawling and stepping over people that are combat loaded on the floor. And I saw this huge gaping hole in the back of the airplane. All daylight back there.
And then Snedeker spots what could be an even more serious problem.
Hydraulic fluid is pumping out. Control cables are dangling in the breeze, flopping back and forth, and it just reminded me of looking at some spaghetti. That was the first thought in my mind.
The flight engineer also notices that the plane is losing its hydraulic fluid fast.
Pilot, we've lost number 1 hydraulic system. We've just lost number 2 hydraulics.
Hydraulic fluid helps the crew move the massive control surfaces on the plane. The rudder and elevator at the back, and the ailerons and flaps on the wing. There are 4 separate hydraulic systems on the plane. Now 2 of them are completely empty. And as Trainer dives towards 10,000 feet, his plane is going much faster than it should, and he can't pull up.
And I kept pulling back on the yoke, thinking that I could slow down, pull back more and more and more.
I'm not getting anything out of the yoke. How about you? Nothing.
And we were just totally puzzled. What is going wrong?
Pulling on his yoke should bring the plane's nose up and slow it down. If he can't pull the plane up soon, it'll plow straight into the ground.
And I'm concerned at that point we're still falling. We're not leveling out.
In the belly of the plane, Ray Snedeker reports what he sees to the cockpit.
Pilot! Cargo bay! Go ahead.
And I told him that the part of the ramp was missing, pressure door was gone, and hydraulic lines and control cables have been cut.
The problem is now much worse than we thought.
Declare an emergency. Saigon, this is MAC 80218, and we're declaring emergency. We require
immediate return to base.
Unlike commercial airlines, there was nobody that came onto the PA system and announced what was happening. So I just kind of focused on the children.
After struggling with his crippled jet, Trainer's efforts finally seem to pay off.
And now the airplane levels itself off, and we're saying, wow, thank goodness that we're finally making it out of this.
As quickly as it leveled off, the plane begins to climb again. The nose of the jet begins pulling up into the sky.
And so I relax the yoke, and what happens? Nothing. I'm still going straight up now.
Unless Trainer can gain some speed, his plane will soon stall and tumble from the sky.
And it got higher and higher, and pretty soon I'm going almost straight up.
In desperation, he dips one wing, forcing the nose down.
I'm now in a very, very steep dive, and there's nothing I can do, seemingly, to bring the nose up. And so, counterintuitive, I added power, and when I did that, the airplane pulled itself out of the dive, and I started to go back up again, but this time I stopped it at 10,000 feet and rolled out, and I realized that I had learned how to control the airplane.
Trainer can't control his plane's pitch as he usually does, by pushing and pulling on his control column. Instead, by gently increasing and decreasing power to his engines, he seems to be able to keep his plane level.
At that point, I realized that my only pitch control was the throttle.
The plane has descended to 10,000 feet. There's now enough oxygen to breathe.
100, it's safe to remove our mask. Gear down, and before landing checklist.
I headed directly for Saigon and began a descent and began positioning myself for a final, much like you would in a glider.
Don't worry,
We're taking care of it up in the cockpit. We're gonna be down soon.
I'm trying to provide comfort to these passengers. At the same time, I know we're in serious trouble because the airplane is still going down.
Captain Trainer has coaxed his injured jet down to just over 4,000 feet. 11 kilometers from the airport, he turns his jet to line up with the runway when his plane surprises him again.
In the final turn to the runway, when I banked the airplane, the nose dropped and I couldn't continue my turn. I had to level the wings so that I had enough lift that the nose didn't keep descending.
Captain Trainer had to stop turning before he could line up with the runway. He's now losing altitude fast, and his prospects are becoming increasingly grim.
While we were working in the cargo compartment, Loadmaster came to me and said, we need to get upstairs because we're going to crash land. When I get to the top of the ladder, I've changed my mind and think I need to be in the cargo compartment when this airplane does get on the runway so I can help evacuate down there. As I try to leave, the flight engineer grabs me by my left elbow, throws me into a seat, and about the time I hit the seat, I can hear the ground screaming. It's a loud scream. It's coming closer.
Prepare for an imminent crash landing.
Get down on the floor! Prepare for emergency landing! Mom, get down!
When we started to go down, my mother and I were focusing on what should we be doing to brace for impact.
We had a big open field in front of us. When I got within about 200 feet of the ground, I said, "We're going in."
The plane is hurtling towards the ground at almost 500 kilometers per hour.
I reach down, grab my seatbelt, and when the seatbelt snaps,
we touched the ground relatively easily, and we popped back in the air. The jump seat said to me, "Bud, we're gonna make it." But I could see looming ahead of me was this huge, huge river. So I added power.
My mom was on one side of the aisle, and I was on the other. And she says, "Come over here and sit with me."
And even with full power at that point, I was still continuing to sink.
my whole life went into slow motion. The airplane is coming apart where I'm sitting. All kinds of debris is flying through the air. And it went on and on and on. It seemed like forever.
When I was going upside down, I remember saying, goodbye to my wife a couple of times, because I was gone. And then it was quiet.
When the plane came to a stop, I looked for my mom. I didn't see her anywhere. At that point, it was all a little bit surreal that I didn't even really know what had just happened. All I knew was that we needed to get the babies out of there.
Trainer and the rest of the cockpit crew have survived.
When I stepped out of the window, what was clear after you looked around, the airplane broke up into its component parts. The tail dropped off, the flight deck broke away, the troop compartment and the wings, they separated from the cargo compartment. The cargo compartment itself disintegrated, essentially.
Behind the cockpit, the plane's wings, which hold the fuel tanks, are burning. The passenger section of the plane is largely intact and separated from the scorching heat of the burning wings. Lieutenant Wirtz and many others who had been in the passenger section survive.
Then we started bringing babies out. And I could hear some helicopters coming. At that point, I was not looking for my mother because I had been assured that she was okay. I was to go to the hospital and just wait for her there. And then that's when I took a couple of the babies and walked over and got on.
A day that began with the promise of hope has ended in disaster. Just minutes after the crash of the first baby lift mission, rescue workers are on the scene searching for survivors. Almost everyone in the cargo area was killed instantly when the plane slammed down the second time. The dead, the injured, and the survivors are taken to hospitals in Saigon and Thailand.
Since I was not injured, I just took a seat and was waiting for my mother while they brought in a lot of the babies. Then somebody came over to me and told me that my mother had died. I remember holding on for dear life, so she said, "Come over here and sit with me."
Barb Adams' last decision was to be near her daughter.
Just as I sat down on the floor, we must have hit. She flew forward somewhere. And that's the last time I saw my mother.
"175 people survived the crash of the Air Force jet. But more than 150 have been killed. More than half of them were children.
And it was really such a blow in what had already been a very tragic and sad story of the collapse of South Vietnam. And then who would have thought that in the middle of all that tragedy, that the American Air Force would crash a plane full of Vietnamese babies and small children.
The investigation begins immediately. The next day, along with the investigators, Captain Bud Trainer returns to the smoldering wreckage of his plane on a special mission of his own.
I had to leave a couple of crew members out at the aircraft. And so I went back the next morning.
The bodies of 2 dead crewmen are still pinned down by the wreckage.
So we took a lot of tie-down chains and put them together and did the old heave-ho with a whole lot of people to move the flap of wreckage that was pinning the 2 crew members. And we got them out of there. It's always important to finish the job, and we did. But then I had a very naive approach to what was going to happen next. I kind of envisioned the guys in the silver helmets and put out the white rope. This is going to be a secure site. And that was when I got the shock that, hey, there are no guards out here. There's a Vietnamese soldier going through my suitcase wearing my flight jacket. And he had an AR-15, and I didn't.
That's my jacket. I'm Bud Traynor.
And we established that my coat had the same name on it.
That's mine.
As my flight suit. And so the coat he was wearing was mine. So he begrudgingly gave me my coat and then proceeded to go through the rest of my suitcase.
It's not only Traynor's jacket. Looters are picking the plane clean. Dave Scheiding is a structural engineer with the Air Force.
When we got to the site, we had some concern to begin with because there was a tremendous amount of civilian people out there actually picking up parts, which, of course, that didn't help us much as far as the investigation goes.
He's part of a team that goes to Saigon to try to figure out why the plane crashed.
This investigation was very unique from a couple of standpoints. The first standpoint, of course, the people taking parts away from us, but second, the country was in extreme chaos. It was essentially falling.
Frank Huskin is also part of the investigative team.
The NVA and the VidCong are all around, and we were only out there during the daytime, but it was a very uncomfortable feeling. Very uncomfortable feeling.
One of the first things we wanted to rule out was sabotage and a bomb. So we brought in dogs from the Philippines, bomb-sniffing dogs.
Take him back there to the rear of the plane.
With North Vietnamese soldiers so close, a direct attack or sabotage are obvious theories.
Initially, they had all thought that it had been a bomb placed in the luggage compartment, or it had been a missile that shot the plane down.
During the rush to board the aircraft, personal luggage was loaded but not thoroughly checked. This added to the speculation that a bomb may have been smuggled on board. The dogs find no trace of a bomb, and investigators find no evidence of explosive residue on the plane. It clearly wasn't attacked. But something had caused the cargo door to fail.
We had to find the doors, if at all possible, to make sure that we didn't have a problem with other C-5s that would cause this type of crash.
Soon, the massive C-5As will be desperately needed to get America out of Vietnam. Finding out what happened to this one couldn't be more urgent.
It was beyond important. At the time, we had approximately 100 C-5 aircraft. We grounded the C-5s until such time that we could figure out, one, what the problem was, and two, what were we going to do to prevent it from happening again.
Hey, guys!
As they examine the wreckage, investigators also try to find out why the crew had such difficulty controlling the plane.
Look how this is sheared off.
The cables that Ray Snediger saw leaking hydraulic fluid were the ones that controlled the plane's elevator. Since the elevator controls pitch, Captain Traynor had no way of guiding his plane up and down.
Cargo bay!
Declare an emergency. Saigon. Emergency. Return to base.
When there's no control of the elevator, which allows for up and down pitch, an airplane will set up an oscillation up and down. His oscillation started as nose was going down, and then it picked up speed, and then it started pitching up.
A falling plane's aerodynamic properties will force it to follow a predictable pattern. As lift increases, the nose naturally tilts upwards. Without the elevators to counteract the motion, it will continue until the plane moves so slowly that it stalls, falling back to the ground. It explains the strange motion of the giant C-5A. By adjusting the thrust to his engines, Traynor was able to keep the jet from rising and falling. Investigators believe the cables were sheared off when the cargo door exploded from the plane. But they still don't know why the door failed in the first place.
Then we made the determination we were going to have to try and find the doors.
But the doors are somewhere at the bottom of the South China Sea.
Our next problem was trying to figure out the ballistics of those doors. Nobody had ever even thought of figuring out ballistics of two doors flying through the air from 23,000 feet.
Relying on the airspeed and the altitude at the moment of decompression, investigators learned the plane was 46 kilometers from the coast of Vietnam.
When the doors went out, the airplane was moving across the water at about 600 feet per second. Therefore, we had to come down with a pretty good estimate for the Navy to even know where to look.
Ships from the U.S. 7th Fleet crisscross the South China Sea looking for the rear door. For the first several days, they can't find anything. The South China Sea has swallowed the evidence. At the crash site, investigators are becoming increasingly frustrated. A great deal of wreckage has been stolen by scavengers. An important clue could be among the pieces taken away. To retrieve these parts, the Air Force offers to buy them back.
The strategy was to provide leaflets throughout the city of Saigon and the surrounding area. We want every piece of material from the aircraft back, and we will also pay you if you will turn this in to us.
11 days after the crash, flyers are delivered to local officials and distributed throughout the city. Investigators do eventually recover the camera that was used by a film crew on board the plane. They hope it can show them exactly what happened. But the film inside the camera has already been removed. Another piece of the wreck turned in during the buyback program is just what they're looking for.
We were trying to get the black boxes back because that's the thing we really wanted.
All C-5As are fitted with a computer system that records vital information about the plane's operation. It records engine settings, airspeed, altitude, and hundreds of other parameters onto a magnetic tape. The system is called Mayday, Malfunction Detection Analysis and Recording System. It wasn't found at the crash site. The Mayday is eventually returned for a reward, but it proves to be a disappointment.
It didn't identify the reason for the doors and the ramps failing, but it did provide us a sequence of events in a lot of areas, including altitude, airspeed, the performance of the aircraft itself during that time frame.
As investigators continue to look for the cause of the crash, the situation in Vietnam gets worse. 2 days after they receive the Mayday, the South Vietnamese president resigns. On April the 23rd, 100,000 North Vietnamese troops approach Saigon. The noose around the city is tightening quickly.
While we were out in the rice paddy, you could see burning hamlets and villages, and in the distance they were on fire. You could hear the explosions and so forth of mortars.
While the situation in Vietnam continues to unravel, The US Navy finally has some success at sea. On April the 26th, they find the cargo ramp and part of the pressure door of Trainor's plane. If investigators don't find the answers here, they may not find them anywhere. They're running out of time, and they're running out of leads. When the ramp is examined, investigators make a disturbing discovery.
On that ramp, 2 of the stirrups were in great condition. They were perfect. They had not failed, so obviously it told us that at least 2 of the locks had just unlocked themselves.
The C5A has 14 locks holding the rear cargo door shut, 7 on each side. The door recovered from the sea tells investigators that for some reason, 3 of the locks designed to hold it shut had either unlocked in flight or had never locked at all.
This flight was actually like a ticking bomb. When they closed the ramps, all those locks would look like they were in a locked position. When it took off, the fuse was lit. And as the aircraft climbed out, the fuse kept burning.
As the plane climbed away from Saigon, the pressure outside the jet dropped. The air inside pushed with increasing force against the cargo door. Then, as the plane passed through 23,000 feet, with 3 latches unlocked, the pressure on the door was too much.
With the 3 locks that failed all in a row, it was just too much load for the other 4 locks to actually pick up, and which resulted in the catastrophic failure of the ramp itself.
But investigators still don't know why the locks failed. Before they can find the answer, the situation in Vietnam deteriorates completely. Saigon is under siege. On April the 27th, the investigators take all of the evidence they can and leave. It's simply too dangerous to stay.
When we left Saigon, we were the last 2 C-141s to leave Tan Son Air Base. They were essentially losing their country at that time, and after that, it was only helicopters that got out.
Investigators hope they have all the clues they need to solve the mystery of the crash. They know they won't be coming back to Vietnam to look for any more. April the 30th, 1975. The war in Vietnam ends. From the rooftop of the American embassy, the last remaining Americans in Vietnam are flown to safety. Back in the United States, investigators continue their work. Since the C-5 is in service around the world, they need to know why 3 locks on the cargo door failed.
When we got back to Texas, it was to help us verify the failure sequence.
Investigators discover something potentially alarming about the cargo plane's rear door. Parts from the C-5A were actually removed from the plane, cannibalized to service another cargo plane. The locks on the rear door of the C-5A are connected to each other by a series of tie rods. The rods can be lengthened or shortened to ensure the locks are completely closed. It's these tie rods which were removed from the baby lift plane. At the time, the enormous cargo planes were in constant demand.
The Air Force was very short of parts, and so they came up with a standard practice for maintenance that they could cannibalize parts off of aircrafts that are not being flown. It's authorized, and it's a good operation if you respect it and treat it properly.
The tie rods were replaced before the baby lift plane left for Saigon, but for some reason they hadn't held. To try to figure out what happened, investigators rebuild one of the locks that was supposed to keep the rear door closed.
We essentially built a working model of that ramp, and we had to do that because we didn't get all the parts back because of the people picking them up, parts out in the ocean and everything that we never got back.
Investigators aren't convinced that the problem is in the basic design of the lock. They suspect that before the plane left California, the engineers who replaced the rods didn't follow the proper procedures.
When we're talking about the locks, the distances that we're talking about are very, very small. We could be talking about the 16th, 32nd of an inch difference between being locked and unlocked.
The re-rigging was done before the plane left the United States.
Show me how you re-rig it.
After the locks were re-rigged, they should have checked to make sure they were working. That wasn't done. Without the check, no one would have noticed that the re-rigging was done improperly.
I would say that this accident actually started back at Travis Air Force Base in California. When the 2 tie rods that had been cannibalized earlier were replaced, they were not installed properly.
Loadmaster, close cargo bay doors.
When the door was opened and shut in Saigon, there was a warning that not everything was perfect.
We had some difficulty getting it to lock, so we had to open and close it 3-4 times. But it seemed to be routine, and in the heat of the moment, we didn't think anything about it.
But 12 minutes after liftoff, as the plane continued to climb, the 3 improperly closed locks were forced open by the building air pressure. The remaining locks could not take the extra load. The cargo door burst open and was torn off the fuselage.
You just can't take shortcuts. And if it's pulled a couple of rods out, run out and put them back in, that's not going to hack it.
The investigators have found their answers, and in their final report make specific recommendations that will make the C-5A safer. As a result, the Air Force designs a pin that slips through each lock. If the door isn't properly shut, the pins can't slide into place.
We essentially Murphy-proofed it by putting steel pins in there so that when the lock is in the over-center position, if you can insert these safety pins, then you know that the system is properly rigged.
Ray Snediger retired from the Air Force as a Chief Master Sergeant.
This mission was probably the most discouraging in some ways based on part of the outcome. But also, it was refreshing in the fact that we displayed such good airmanship, such courage, and we were able to save so many people.
After 28 years of service, Bud Traynor retired from the Air Force as a colonel.
I think everyone second-guesses themselves to see if there was something else that they could do. I am very fortunate in that I never found something that I said, I sure wish I had done X. It just wasn't there.
That pilot did a super job. The fact that anybody survived this crash is just remarkable. The ones that were saved are very fortunate that that particular crew was in charge of that aircraft. Being a pilot myself and knowing they only had 1 aileron and 4 engines, by rights they all should have been dead.
Investigation Board does not normally recommend decorations. That's not part of their job. But in this case, we recommended to the Air Force that they be considered for a high decoration.
Surviving crew members, including Captain Bud Traynor and Sergeant Ray Snediger, were awarded medals by the Air Force for heroism and extraordinary achievement. One of the orphans that survived was baby Ina.
Ina?
Today, she's known as Kelly Jackson Brownlee.
April 4th, 1975. It's definitely a pivotal point in my life where I left part of myself behind in Vietnam.
When Operation Baby Lift resumed, Kelly, along with hundreds of other orphans, were flown to the United States. She was eventually adopted by a family near Seattle, Washington.
There was a 25-year anniversary in April of 2000, and it brought together all of the adults that were adopted from Vietnam. And I ended up meeting someone who's very special and actually ended up marrying.
Chris Brownlee and his wife Kelly were both airlifted out of Vietnam on April the 5th, 1975, one day after the crash.